Invented in Holland in 1898, the deli slicer launched a revolution behind the meat counter. No longer was it necessary to carve meats and cheeses entirely by hand. With the turn of a crank, the deli slicer produces perfect and precise cuts every time. The modern deli slicer is powered by electricity, with a manual override for the carriage, which delivers food to a spinning blade. Production begins with the cast aluminium base. A worker installs a cam mechanism, which is part of a system for adjusting the thickness of the slice. He threads wiring connected to an on-off indicator light through holes in the base, then screws an index knob onto the shaft protruding from the cam mechanism installed earlier. An important warning label comes next. Then he seals the gap around the blade shaft with silicone and removes the excess with soapy water. Next up is wiring for the slicer motor. They clamp the wires together and bolt the clamps to the inside of the aluminium base. They insert the on-off switch in the plastic trim. Then attach a device that will slide to adjust the gap between the gauge plate and the blade, thereby controlling the thickness of the cut. The deli slicer is ready for the slide rod and carriage subassembly, which will deliver food to the spinning blade. The carriage will move across a track, which they now attach to the lip of the base. They test the carriage assembly to confirm that it's on track. They secure the blade motor to the wiring with bolts. Connect the motor to the blade shaft with a drive belt. Operating the motor allows them to observe the drive belt and pulleys in action, confirming that they operate smoothly. Once the gauge plate is installed, they move on to making the blade. Computer-guided cutters chamfer the steel surface and carve a precise bevel onto the rim. It goes from a rough blank to a precisely shaped blade in just minutes. They etch the company logo and product date into the blade metal. Another lathe pre-sharpens the blade to the point where it could cut through something as fine as 0.004 of a centimeter. A worker slides the blade onto the drive shaft and secures it in place with a nut. They check the alignment of the gauge plate in relation to the blade. They turn the thickness mechanism to close the gap and check it again. With a dial indicator, they measure the blade even more precisely. This tool confirms that the blade is in the exact position for cutting, and that it won't lose that position once activated. The deli slicer comes with its own sharpening system, a grinding wheel in a protective casing. They mount the grinder and activate it to hone the edge to razor sharpness. When the blade cuts through tissue paper cleanly, it's ready for real slicing action. They screw the arm for the sliding tray to the carriage and use a spacer disc to establish the correct distance between the food tray and the blade. They set the food tray on the arm and check the gap between it and the blade. Once the two are correctly aligned, they remove the spacer and fix the safety guard to the blade. Now for a test, verifying that the tray doesn't drag or scrape against the blade guard. Below, they've installed rods to move the carriage on the track. The system can be manually operated or driven by a second motor. Finally, they clean this slicing machine until it shines. At 61 kilograms, this deli slicer is no lightweight, so they use a crane to lower it into the packaging box. Hefty and heavy duty, this deli slicer should have what it takes to cut it at the meat market.